Oops. Coach Massey here from M2 Speed, Strength, and Performance with another episode of Move Your Feet. And this is the basics of ground reaction forces for training, episode number 2. We are literally filming these episodes one by one to field incoming emails to see how we might be able to answer these inquiries as intelligently as we possibly can. We're not PhDs, but man, we're going to try to do our best for you guys. So actually the most popular inquiry from the last episode was whatever happened to the eggs. And as you see, there were eggs in here. We did not wind up smashing them. Eggs are a little expensive right now. We actually ate them, and Coach Matt eats about 6 or 7 dozen eggs a week. So we figured we'd just put them in the pan and let him go to town. So that's what happened with the eggs. But actually, what we were going to attempt to do with the eggs was to follow up how we were ending off our last episode. We were ending the last episode with a couple of simple demonstrations that posed questions about ground reaction forces. We had a simple medicine ball slam, we had a slam foot, and we were going to bring the egg in to ask the question of whether or not the egg breaks because of the impact or if it's just ground reaction forces. We also had the example that if you use one of those jelly jam balls, they actually stop and they don't come back because the ground reaction forces are dissipated and distributed across that particular ball. So we're going to take an egg, we're going to see what happens. We all knew it was going to break, but we really wanted to pose the question of if it was an infinity floor, which would just keep on going with the egg, and there were never any ground reaction forces, would the egg actually break? Much like when you see a commercial where they drop an egg on a really cushy bed and the egg doesn't break. But do me a favor, refer back to episode 1 to cover most of those ground reaction force basics. In this episode, we're going to field probably the second most popular set of inquiries. We've got a few dozen emails really just asking about force in general. And we did cover that in our world, when we talk about force, we're talking about human kinetic energy, the energy that we make. And we said for ground reaction forces and for movement, you have to have force, and force is required for motion. But we really have to take a look at some of the inquiries we had, and I'm going to bring Matt in. Coach Matt's going to come in. And as we sifted through these inquiries, we had questions about what is force, how do you generate force, all these different inquiries. So we're going to try to pick them off one by one. And in our world, our Newtonian world, we're just going to say, as we train, force is human energy, right? It's important for our clients and athletes to understand the underlying issues here. They'll appreciate it more, they'll appreciate the programming more, and it's really a level of credibility when you start to teach them. And, thank God for Google. You can go back out and gain more information and knowledge on force whenever you'd like. So these questions about human energy or force, and how we get movement, and if force is required for motion, and if something can move, and if you can achieve velocity with force but without movement. It was a lot of really tricky questions in there. So we tried to encapsulate them, and now we're going to basically look at force, work, and velocity. So we have a simple demonstration. If I tell Matt, come over here and push this cinder block wall. So Matt, push the wall as hard as you can and stop. Okay, so the wall didn't go anywhere, but Matt was exerting force. So that was good. Now, if for some reason he had ate a lot of Wheaties or a lot of oatmeal for this generation, if the wall started to move, he would have both force and work, because now there was some movement to the object. The force he was exerting and applying now caused the wall to move. It's probably not going to happen no matter how steadily it is. The wall's not going to go anywhere. Likewise, Matt, get behind this sled, please. So we all know that we do sled pushes for conditioning and, wherever you use it in your programming. So Matt, once again, push the sled. Go ahead, push it through the wall. All right, so relax. Once again, you want to get technical about the sled rising up, about getting some vertical lift. Other than that, the force was being applied to the sled. The sled was not moving, so you had force without work. Now, if you take the sled and we turn her around, and I tell Matt, tuck yourself in there and just apply force to the sled to make it move. Go. And stop. Okay, now we had force applied, it began to move, we now have work, and the speed at which the sled was moving in a given direction, that's velocity. So, you can have force without work, you cannot have work without force. And that's really a very good general example you guys can use when training your athletes and climbing. And you know, once we get into force, I think what we're really looking to achieve is velocity. Everybody, the way we train, we get into some velocity-based training, etc., etc. So we're just going to keep these in mind. Force can be exerted. Go push the wall, Matt. Matt's exerting force. Wall's not moving. Push the sled, Matt. Force, work, velocity. Cool. So that's really good. So, you know, even in zero gravity, let's say you're in outer space, and I know you're not too far out of high school, you're in college, and they talk about orbital forces, or if something gets caught in orbit. Even to break orbit in zero gravity, you're going to need a force to interrupt that. And I think the best illustration would be if you see like a rocket gets caught in orbit, the only way they can break that orbit or change directions is by using propulsion or using their boosters. So force is necessary for motion. Back in this Newtonian world, we look at force in a different way and how we apply it to lifts, to our speed protocols, our agility protocols. And it's really kind of simple when you break it down. And that's what we're trying to do. We're just trying to break it down. So once again, back in the Newtonian world, I believe some of the other questions we got into was people asked about terms like strength and power. And these are our opinions. We think strength is kind of not a great term. You know, some people say it's a bogus term. I think when people are talking about strength, we're thinking about somebody can be strong. I think that's a general term. But when people talk about strength, I think they're talking about like the 1 RM maybe. You know, most people would deal with say, oh, the kid's strong, he benches, 400 pounds. So when they're talking about strength, I think what they're really talking about is max force. The maximum amount of force the person can produce. And in general, when we run across that, it's really how much force they can produce one time. People asked about power. Power is really just force over time or force repeatedly. But we really like to take a look at 4 frames, which is basically that max force. We like to look at the power. We like to look at something called RFD, or rate of force development. And then we talk about something called force endurance, which gets kind of interesting no matter what sport we're training for. So once again, max force, let's just think about it this way. It's the maximum amount of force that you can produce. Not sure what the duration is going to be, but it's the maximum amount of force that you can produce. Let's say one time, just to keep it simple and global for your clients and athletes. Now, power is force over time, how much force you can produce over time or repeatedly. But if we just look at max force for a second, and let's say a guy can bench or a gal can bench 400 pounds, and one guy can make that 1 RM max force production in, let's say it takes him 8 seconds to grind it out. But the girl gets on the bench and she goes off the rack, down, boom, she's up in 3. Who are you going to probably want playing on your team? The 3-second person. So it takes him 3 seconds to get to max force. And that might not be the greatest example because you have an eccentric phase and then a concentric phase. But if you get my drift, you always want to work towards cutting down the time it takes to get the force development. So rate of force development, or RFD, is the amount of time it takes you to get from 0 to max force. And then lastly, and then we'll wrap it up, so you can start heading back around here, Matt. I'll mention that, yeah, thank you. So we have force endurance. So now force endurance is basically how long you can maintain given degrees of forces through range. How long maybe can you maintain max force? So maybe that argument Maddie and I just had flips around. Is the guy actually maintaining max force for 8 seconds? So is there a trade-off? Listen, I always say I do not have all the answers, but I most certainly will provoke thought. So you guys start working through this stuff. Please reflect on the episodes. Please keep the emails coming. We're trying to keep it simple. We're trying to keep it short. And the really great news is I'm going to encapsulate all of this and bring it to a Perform Better seminar this year in 2023. I'm not quite sure where I'm going to be speaking yet, but I would love for you guys to come out and have a look. We're going to encapsulate all of this and eventually also work more towards what we really, really care about in sport, velocity. So until next time, Coach Massey here from M2 Speed, Strength, and Performance. That was another episode of Move Your Feet. Greatness is forged, not fabricated. Have a great day.